Hello everyone. Welcome to this year's Jack Jeffrey's lecture on sustainability, which happens every 2 years. And this year we're going to be welcoming Helen Holmes from Manchester University on the topic of what a load of rubbish, bins, behaviours and the circular economy. Before we start, can I ask if you've got a mobile phone, could you please make sure it's on silent for the duration of the lecture to avoid any interruptions. We're not expecting, speaking of interruptions, we're not expecting any fire alarms, so if the alarm does go off, then consider it a real fire and follow the instructions of the stewards who will guide you outside the building and into the car park outside to safety. If you would like to tweet or whatever you do on other platforms that aren't Twitter these days, Blue Sky, about tonight's lecture, please use hashtag InsightsNCL. To do so, thank you. And following Helen's lecture, there will be a chance to ask some questions, and some of those questions have been submitted already when you registered for tonight's event, so thank you for those of you who did that. So, with those formalities out of the way, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Dr Helen Holmes, who is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Manchester in the Sustainable Consumption Institute, and she's also Deputy Director of the University's Sustainable Futures Platform. Helen is an interdisciplinary social scientist whose work explores the sociology of consumption, sustainability, materiality, waste, and the circular economy. Having completed a geography BA at Durham University, we will let her off for that, in 2002, she worked in marketing for Yale and the Cooperative Bank before returning to academia in 2005 for an MA in human geography at Sheffield University. She then had a PhD funded by ESRC to explore hairdressing and women's hair care. Is that right? Yes? A bit of a departure. And then held 2 postdoctoral research positions at Sheffield, linking material science and social science. Since joining Manchester in 2015 as the Holsworth Fellow based in the Sustainable Consumption Institute, Helen has worked on multiple interdisciplinary projects. All the best people work on interdisciplinary projects, including one exploring 1990s rave culture and how Manchester's nighttime economy has changed since the heyday of the hacienda, which sadly I think most of us in this room missed, maybe. Her latest project is the UKRI-funded study One Bin to Rule Them All, involving social science, material science, and business models to explore the barriers and challenges to household plastic recycling. This is a particularly important challenge for our city here in Newcastle, where our recycling rate are a worryingly low 29%, if I've got that right, which is well below the national average, so maybe some pointers for our own city tonight. Helen has also explored the thorny topic of fly tipping in a project called The Waste Tip, seeking an understanding of the impact of fly tipping, why it occurs, and how it can be tackled. Her most recent book, The Materiality of Nothing, which came out in 2023, draws together Helen's research expertise on the social practices of consumption, waste, and disposal, and their relevance for environmental sustainability. Helen's also former editor of the Sociology Journal and is a member of the advisory board of the British Beauty Council's Sustainability Coalition. So many strings to Helen's bow. So before we start the lecture, just a quick bit of background on what the Jack Jeffery lecture is. This is a biennial lecture that was set up by a generous donation from Jack Jeffery, who died back in 2017 and was a Newcastle University alumnus and chair of convocation. The lecture is given in alternate years on the theme of sustainability, and Jack's daughters help us to identify speakers every 2 years, and Jack's daughter Wynne is here this evening, who's made the long journey up from Southampton to see this year's lecture, so thanks for joining us, Wynne. Previous Jack Jeffery lecture speakers include Jonathan Porritt, Sir Liam Donaldson and Katie Roerlich. And in the words of Professor Tom Curtis, who is a professor here in environmental engineering at Newcastle, and can't join us tonight sadly, but he said that Jack was a friend to the university and to environmental engineering as a discipline, so we're very pleased to be able to host Jack's lecture this evening. So without further ado then, I would like to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr Helen Holmes, and enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you very much to the Jeffery family as well for the invite, and to Umbereen, where she is, for all of the sorting out, because there's been lots of to and fro in terms of getting me organised to be here. So as Alistair noted, for my sins, I did my undergraduate just down the road at Durham University, so please don't hiss at me now. And I've got very fond memories of Newcastle whilst I was there. I did, have the odd trip out of Durham every now and again. And one of them, I was just thinking about this when I was preparing this lecture, was our frequent trips to the Tuxedo Princess and its revolving dance floor. So I was just thinking about that on the way up. I haven't been there. I don't even know if it's still there. Is it still there? No. It's probably something about waste we could talk about there, scrap, etc. But yeah, it was very fond memories. So I want to ask you all a question. Have you ever been confused about recycling? Yeah. Okay, I would imagine that probably most of us have at some point. You have stood there with an item at the bin and thought, well, which one does this go into? Well, this talk is all about that, and why getting to grips with these issues that we've got, particularly in the UK, is a vital part of tackling climate change. So a little bit about me to begin with. So yes, I was a human geographer to begin with. I then did defect to sociology when I moved to Manchester, just mainly because my work fitted a little bit better in there. But I've always had an interest in stuff. So I'm interested in the everyday objects of life that enable us to function, to get up in the morning, to go to work, to get dressed, to operate, to go to the gym, the everyday things. So often in studies of consumption in particular, there's a focus on more of the sacred. So thinking about the bigger items, the car, the house, those big purchases. I'm interested in the very everyday stuff, the profane. So the very sort of mundane stuff that we take for granted that we often just ignore. So in the last 10 years, my work has moved more onto the realms of waste, and in particular into disposal. So I'm interested in that practice of consuming, but how does disposal fit within that? What are the activities that enable us to dispose of things? So I've got another question for you. How many people in the audience have been sitting around, have things sitting around in their homes that you're waiting to get rid of, or you're not sure what to do with? Cute, yeah. So that might be stuff in garages. That tends to where this stuff gets dumped. Might be another word. Under beds, in cupboards. So from my research, it's things like bread makers, soup makers, a Maggi mix, that's come up numerous times. Things that people have often purchased because they've got this idea, I'm going to make my own bread, I'm going to be really healthy and get some soup. That they use for a matter of weeks. The pandemic was quite bad for us all doing this. And then it gets stuck in a cupboard for the next few years. And we're not quite sure what to do with it. I'm interested in all of that stuff. And I'm interested, what are the processes that lead us to then dispose of things? And when I think about disposal, I don't just think about that act of putting something in the bin. I think about that process that you might go where these things sit in these transitional zones around the home and you're not quite sure what to do with them. So all those activities, which sort of are part of this disposal practice, so to speak. So, as Alistair mentioned, last year I had a book out. It's got a bit of a lofty academic title, but it brought a lot of this stuff together. So these relationships we have with everyday things, how these relationships can continue even when those things are out to sight, but also how those relationships can continue even when we have disposed of something and that thing is no longer in our physical possession, which sounds quite strange, but you can probably all sit here and think of something that you have got rid of at some point and it still lingers in your mind. So it might be an item of clothing that you gave to a charity shop, which is now back in fashion and you wish you'd kept it. It might be something that you've lost. So I did a little bit of research a few years ago on things that people had lost. Again, it seems a bit weird, but it's amazing what this stuff reveals. So things that people lose, which they then claim can never be replaced. Shoes seem to be very keen on that one, but also weirdly umbrellas. People seem to have quite a big affinity to particular umbrellas. So this book is all about that, but it's also about situating that in its wider relevance and situating that within sustainability. So you may well be sat there wondering, what have bins got to do with climate change? And likewise, how is a sociologist rooting through people's cupboards, which is my weekend habit, related to sustainability? Well, actually quite a lot. So as I've said, how we consume, not just what we consume, but how we consume and how we dispose of things and make those decisions to dispose of things is really important for issues of sustainability. Because we don't just put something in the bin, do we? There's this transition zone, but then there's these other pathways as well for us to get rid of things. So that might be reuse, it might be redistribution, it might be repurpose or repair. What we call these R pathways. So we all know that in the global north we consume too much. Society has this focus on making and consuming of things rather than what happens to them at their end of life. And that's resulting in some really significant environmental challenges and significant waste mountains which are threatening our ecosystems. So some of these are the stats, most up-to-date stats that are around at the minute. So there's 92 million tonnes of textile waste, 353 million tonnes of plastic waste, and 62 million tonnes of e-waste. So that's all the iPhone chargers that stop working after 6 weeks. These are real problems. This amount is produced annually, globally, and is set to rise quite significantly by 2030. So it is a huge challenge. So for me, my work is trying to understand the intervention points. How have we ended up in this situation, and what can we do to stop it? And how understanding the relationship that people have with things can lead us to different points for intervention and different ways of tackling these issues. So a lot of this stuff is sent to landfill. Quite a bit is also sent to energy from waste, or incineration really, both of which have dire environmental costs. So you may have heard in the news a couple of weeks ago, there was a recent report that energy from waste is now producing the equivalent amount of CO2 as burning coal. So it is really significant problems, and these were seen as solutions to our waste, but we're now finding that actually they're just causing more and more problems that need to be addressed. So there's lots of work that's going on in the arena of sustainability and the arena of waste in particular to tackle these different problems, but often they're come at from quite a technocentric point of view. And what we find is that we get these solutions which can cause unintended consequences. So an example of this, and it's always the same one that I tend to pull up, is recycling of plastic bottles into clothing. So this happens a lot. So using the polymers from plastic bottles to create polyester waste. But what happens often is that clothing is sportswear. How often do you wash sportswear? Quite a lot. So every time those items are washed, thousands of microfibres of plastic are being released into ecosystems. There's an unintended consequence. This seems like a great solution to recycle our plastic waste, but it's actually leading to a much bigger problem further downstream. And because nobody's thought about the social practices of what happens with sportswear, the fact that we wash it a lot more than any other clothing, that hasn't been picked up on. Okay, so it's quite a neat example, I think, for sort of illuminating these problems. So the way to tackle this, and certainly our thoughts at the university, and I'm sure my colleagues at Newcastle as well, is about bringing in different knowledges and different expertise. So not just thinking about these technocentric solutions, but thinking about what happens further downstream. Who should we be involving? What are people doing with things? What business models can get involved? So bringing in all these different interdisciplinary perspectives to give joined up solutions to these problems. And that's not just academic knowledge, and that's really important, I think. That's knowledge from industry, it's knowledge from policy, but it's also knowledge from publics as well, okay? And there's lots of cases that we can refer to where public knowledge has been really, really important in avoiding unintended consequences for solutions to environmental sustainability issues. So that's where I'm coming from. So, whose fault is all this waste? So what we find often is that the consumer, and I have some reservations around the word consumer, or the household are blamed. So there are lots of narratives out there that we're all buying too much. We're all too het up about disposable items as well. We all want disposability. And nobody takes care of things any time these days. So you will go out to buy a top, you might go to Primark or Boohoo, and you'll wear that top once and then you'll throw it away. So these are the narratives that are put out there, and there's definitely some validity in those things. cultures of consumption have changed, particularly since the 1950s, and we can trace that change. But is it all the consumers' or the household's fault? And what does such a narrow focus miss? And importantly, who does it miss? And the contributions that those other sectors are making. More on that shortly. So what we find in waste policy in particular is that there is a focus on behavioural change. Behavioural change is quite a big field of study, and it's an idea that there is a right or a wrong way to consume, and importantly, a right or a wrong way to dispose of things. But what does this focus do? Especially when we're thinking about something as messy and complicated and contextual as waste. So if we come back to recycling, and Alistair mentioned 29% in Newcastle, it's quite clear at the minute that our behavioural change policies towards waste and recycling more generally, our wider policies are not working. So the UK recycling rate has remained stagnant at 44% on average for about the last 5 years, I think it is. So we're not doing great. And this is despite a suite of policies coming in which are hopefully going to, which have been aimed at improving that. Things have not changed. So this is where our most recent work comes in. So Alistair mentioned this project. It's actually finished now. We finished back in January. This was a 3-year interdisciplinary project which was thinking about the challenge of recycling and trying to unpick why that recycling rate in the UK is so bad and why things are not getting better. So it was 3 different disciplines. It was myself leading the social science side. We had a polymer chemist leading the material science side, and then we had someone in economics leading a business models, and you can see those 3 around the image there. And the idea was that we wanted to look holistically across the supply chain to try and avoid some of these unintended consequences. So what happens at the start of the chain in terms of materials and what's produced in terms of particularly plastic packaging we were interested in, what's happening at that business model side in terms of how that packaging is put out on the market, what labelling it's given, and then what's happening at the household. So what are people doing with this stuff? What impacts is that having up and down the supply chain? And then right to the end, to the waste management aspect. What's happening at waste management? You know, is this stuff being recycled? Why does it need to be in all these different states, lids on, lids off, etc.? What's actually happening? So we were interested in looking at that really holistically and involving those industry and policy partners along the way. So we've got those different knowledges. So a very interdisciplinary approach. And the overall aim was to think about how we can create a circular economy of plastics. How can we keep plastic in that chain for longer rather than us having this sort of make, take, dispose that we have with a lot of the plastic packaging that's available at the moment, particularly household plastic packaging, so food. So, interestingly, a lot of recycling studies tend to focus more on that material science or on the economic side. There might be a little bit that touches on the household, but it's rarely centred within the project. We made the decision to turn this on its head. So the household was what we actually led from. And that's been quite revolutionary, I think, from an academic sense particularly, and for what has enabled us to be revealed. So we conducted some household trials. It was only a very small study. Unfortunately, the sort of research I do, which is qualitative, very time intensive, but it means working with people for a long period of time and really getting to know what's going on within their lives and within their households. So we took 30 households in Greater Manchester, and there is a narrative around at the minute, and it's been around for a while, that the more socially, economically deprived that you are, the less likely you are to engage in recycling and in good practice with waste as well. So we wanted to investigate this. So we decided on 30 households. We then decided to split those by the indices of deprivation. So we chose 10 in the most deprived, 10 in the least deprived, and 10 with a sort of middling score of deprivation. And in Greater Manchester, there was an ideal area, I can't say where for ethical purposes, that was about 5 miles apart of these places that we could do that. So they were living in close proximity and they all had the same waste rules and waste practices. So we recruited the households. We started off with an in-depth interview talking to them about recycling. What were the issues that they were facing? What problems did they have with local authority rules? But also broadening that out to think about consumption. So did they go to the supermarket and deliberately try and avoid plastic packaging? Were they trying to buy in bulk? What other things were they doing which might feed in to their recycling habits at home? So we did this, and then we gave them an extra bin for 2 weeks. So in Greater Manchester, it's quite unique. Up until, funnily enough, 6 weeks ago, Greater Manchester only collected plastic bottles. So they wouldn't collect any pots, tubs or trays, just plastic bottles. So they're quite behind in terms of the rest of the UK. About 80% of the UK does collect those other items, but in Manchester it was just plastic bottles. So a lot of these households were like, great, an extra bin, somewhere I can put more of my stuff. And we said to them, for the 2 weeks, put anything you think is plastic in that bin. And that was deliberate because we actually wanted to find out what people do and don't think are plastic, because that is a great source of confusion. And there are many things around us that are plastic that people don't realise. So we gave them the bin. They filled it up for 2 weeks. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, we took that bin away. This was a logistical nightmare because of waste licensing. So we had to get involved the local authority, we had to involve Suez, we had to involve Biffa, but we managed to pull it off in the end. Took the bins away and we took them to a local recycling facility, and I've got a picture of that in a minute, which is owned by Suez, and we sorted through that waste. So we sorted by packaging type and also by polymer type, and there were some surprises in there which I'll say a little bit about in a moment. And what we found was from that each of those households were averaging out about 200 pieces of plastic just over that 2 weeks period each. Okay, so nearly 6,000 collected in total, 200 per household. So a huge amount really for such a short period of time. We then went back to the households afterwards. We talked through the findings of the trial and we asked them about what went well. You know, had they changed their practices? Did it make them think about something a bit differently? Did it make them think differently about the local authority rules? And then we brought all of this information together. So I think it's about 400,000 words of transcript, which we then analysed along with the findings and the data to pull together our core recommendations, which I'll go on to in a second. And this was all bolstered by interviews with different people along the supply chain. So policymakers, the local authority, but also wider government as well, packaging producers, manufacturers, retail as well, to bring all of this evidence together. So this is us. This is me on the left. You can see it's lovely and clean where we were, sifting through the waste for a weekend. It's not something I ever want to do again. It was not pleasant after, and it took me quite a while to get the smell out of my clothes. But it was absolutely fascinating to go through this. A couple of the weird and wonderful things that we ended up with, you can see some of the usual stuff there, milk bottles, you know, wrappers, etc. But we actually ended up with a polyester jumper in one of the bins, which I was sort of quite a bit like, yes, you've really taken that, anything you think is plastic, to the, you know, the extreme there. And also an oil drum. I had the misfortune of emptying that bin and got covered in it. So yeah, it was an interesting time and very insightful. So this was a huge piece of work, and I could stand here all day talking about the findings, but what we've attempted to do is distill that into some core recommendations. And I'll go on to the traction that these core recommendations have had, and hopefully some of you might feel enlightened that things may change in the future with regards to bins and recycling. But we've got 3 main recommendations. The first is about not blaming households. So what we actually found from the research, so I said before, there's this narrative that if you're in a more socioeconomically deprived area, you're less likely to care about recycling, is not true. The motivation to recycle doesn't change across those 3 areas. And we were quite surprised by this because we did expect to see maybe a little bit of variation, and there wasn't. actually what we found is that people are going above and beyond to try and recycle. They are concerned. They're really concerned about what is happening to their waste, particularly in this area where all they could recycle is plastic bottles, and they know in other areas that other things can be put in bins. So what can they do to make this easier? But at the heart of this is a huge issue about confusion and the angst and anxiety that that confusion can cause, not knowing which bin something is supposed to go into. So I hope you're all right with quotes. I'm always a bit dubious about putting them in lectures, particularly when I've got students, but I've got a few. So I'll let you read these and then I'll go into a little bit of an explanation while I just have a drink. Okay, so I can say more about the participants if you're interested at the end, but I think, these sum up a lot of the problems that many people are having as I go through them. So as I said, the local authority we're in, Greater Manchester, only took bottles at the time. So what we see in Christina and Tim's quote is that they are travelling all the way to Cumbria quite regularly, which is quite a distance from Greater Manchester, with their pots, tubs and trays. So there's a real effort there to try and go above and beyond. Now, there's question marks, obviously, about the carbon footprint of travelling to Cumbria, but there is an appetite to try to do more. And then we see, again, sort of a further circumvention of these limited recycling capacities of the local authority with the flexible recycling. So this will be a TerraCycle scheme that's at the co-op. So Gemma and James collecting things up in a big bag. So they've got to find storage for that bag. There's labour involved in this. Storage to hold all that stuff. They've got to take the time out of the day to take it to the co-op, to leave it there. But for me, it really illustrates the motivation there is to go further and above and beyond what the local authority are currently offering, and that people really care. So you might remember at the start of the presentation there was a picture of some bottle tops. So during the course of the trial and the study, we actually ended up with someone who had saved up 1,000 bottle caps, off like milk cartons. And we couldn't understand why we'd ended up with all these. So when we went back to the interview after we finally got to the bottom of it, so this was someone that had been storing them up for a craft project which had got a little bit out of hand. And then they weren't sure what to do with them. So they'd kept hold of them, a bit like this, keeping things in transition zones around the home. They'd kept hold of them because they just didn't know what else to do. So when we came along and were like, put anything you think is plastic in the bin, they were like, yay, have these. Same with the person with the oil drum. So that had been stuck in a shed for 12 months. And that person didn't have the capacity to get to the local tip because they didn't have any transport. So they'd left it there because they just weren't sure what else to do with it. So it really raises these issues that people are facing, but also that motivation to try and do a bit more. So I've got a couple of others. Again, I'll let you read these. So part of this motivation is this coordination with others. So we get inter-household coordination, so coordinating with the households that you live nearby to, your neighbours, as in the case of Mary, who was talking about how, she'd share her bin space with her neighbours. If it got full up, she'd just go and ask somebody else. And this was quite key. This came up a lot. So some of you may have neighbourhood or street WhatsApp groups where some of this stuff happens. And this is never reported. This is never reported in any studies. This is never reported in or taken on board in policy. But this is crucial to how people manage their bin space. And again, illustrates sort of this community cohesion around dealing with waste and setting up like an informal waste management system, so to speak. But again, this motivation. And then the second quote is more about intra-household coordination. So what goes on within households? And this is more, for me, I think, about trying to deal with the confusion. So we found lots of households that have like a process that everybody stuck to within that household who lived there, be it family or whoever else staying with them, to make sure that things remained consistent, because they felt so anxious about whether they were actually getting the rules right, that at least if they had some control over what was happening in their household, it felt like they, were doing something consistent and were doing something well. So we've seen lots and lots of examples of that throughout the course of the research. And I think both of these, particularly that bottom one, again, illuminates that people are bombarded by information and they're not sure what's the right course of action. So having some control in your own home is one way around that. And I'll come more onto messaging in a minute. So the second key point, and this is where I think lots of people will be able to empathise, is around standardisation and simplification. And this is broken down by 3 different areas. So messaging, infrastructure and materials. And the infrastructure one is probably the ones that most people will have some form of feeling towards. But we were interested in seeing how can we make it easier for households to do the right thing? How can we make it much more simple to make those decisions rather than it being something that you've got to put loads of effort in and be thinking, you know, you stood at the bin for ages, which bin does this go into? And then just chucking it into one, hoping for the best. So let's start with messaging. Again, a couple of quotes. So the first one from Larry illuminates the common problem that bin colours do not match. You know, there's a vast variety from bright pink to brown across the country. So in this case, you know, the black bin for Larry is the recycling bin. So the TV show talking about don't put it in your recycling doesn't really add up. So we find that this messaging is really inconsistent. So you get, on one hand, you get local authority advice. You might get that once a year on a leaflet, which most people end up throwing out because where are you going to put it unless you stick it to the fridge? Then we've got conflicting labelling on packaging. So it might have those little triangles on that some people try to interpret to work out what it is and which bin it can go in. It might say something really useful like widely recyclable, but not tell you really what that means and which recycling bin it needs to go in. That will then conflict with media reports. It will probably conflict with what you see on social media, and it will probably also conflict with what friends and family are doing. So as we see with Wendy, she just goes on what other people say you can do. Okay, so people find this information from all these different places, and that's causing huge problems. So we're advocating for, through the projects and through the policy report, which I'll show you a copy of at the end, for getting to grips with this inconsistent messaging. So advocating for a retailer agreement on consistent labelling, and the Waste and Resources Action Partnership are also advocating for that, but also for a better communications plan that's across the UK, that's multi-channel, okay, coming from different sources, to making sure that the BBC are reporting on, you know, your black bin might not be your recycling bin, just being more accurate in these things to encourage this reduction, reuse, and then recycling, because recycling is really the last option we want people to go down, but more on that in a moment. And then this is the one, this is my favourite quote. I'll let you read this. Lots of people can sympathise with this one, I'd imagine. So infrastructure is the place really we need to start. So there is huge variation in capacity across the UK. And that's not just in what's collected, but also how it is collected. So you might be told to wash things, you might be told to take the lids off, which is obviously now difficult now they've all been attached on. You might have been told to crush things. That will be different in different places. So this statistic is actually a little bit out of date, but I haven't got an up-to-date one. But about 2 years ago, this was up to date. So there are currently 391 local authorities with 39 different bin regimes. Okay, so that's quite astounding. And then if you add into that, there are about 2,500, it might be 2,800 municipal recycling facilities across the UK, each with different capacities to sort, different machines, different processes. So it's really, really complicated, and that's where we need to start. So we want to advocate for consistent curbside collection. Now, I'm very sorry to disappoint everybody, but unfortunately, changing the colour of the bins isn't going to happen because it's going to cost too much money and it wouldn't be sustainable to do. But what we can do, and what we're hoping is going to happen, is that the same items will be accepted in each place. So you could travel from Newcastle to Manchester and it will still be the same thing. So you would put plastic, glass, tins in one bin. You would put paper and card in another, just to try and make it more consistent, but also that would happen in the same state. So it'd be lids on, off, crushed, washed, etc., whatever those rules are. So that's what we're advocating for, but that requires targeted investment. It requires investment in capacity and capabilities of the municipal recycling facilities, and then also within the local authorities to be able to change those rules. So it's a huge task. And then the final one are material issues. And this is my last quote, I promise. I do tend to bore people with quotes, but I'll let you read those. So this is standing at the bin and thinking, what is this made of? Okay? And this is really where the sociology starts to really kick in. So how do people attempt to make sense of what something is made of? It's a tactile response, isn't it? You've probably done it yourself. You've stood there with it's often things like crisp packets or bread bags or fruit netting or packaging, and you will go like this, won't you? To try and work out what it is. And that's exactly what all our participants were doing as well. So what we're finding is the current complexity of materials limits recycling. Identifying what something is made of is really not easy for people, and particularly because a lot of packaging designs are multi-materials. So one of the little things we found in the trial, which I was really surprised at, is, windowed envelopes. So we were testing those on the FTIR, some science person will be able to tell me what that is in a minute, like a microscope. And the windows in the envelopes that were coming out were polystyrene. So I think of polystyrene as this white bubbly stuff, not a clear plastic envelope. So even the polymer scientists were like, well, we didn't think that'd happen. So there's this real complexity of the materials that are out there on the market. And partly that is an issue because of the amount of stuff that we end up importing as well. So we've got no control over that, but we do need to try and tackle some of these problems. So as you see in the quotes, people struggling to identify things, and then what that leads to is them deconstructing stuff, like Jacob and Joan. So Joan is getting out this knife and she's trying to slice the crisp tube, I'm not going to name it, in half to try and get what she thinks is the card and what she thinks is the metal bit. And you see a lot of this with cartons as well. So trying to slice off that plastic top and then thinking what is the cardboard bit, which isn't, and putting that in the cardboard bin as well. So we also end up with lots of wish cycling, which you may have heard before. It feels like this, therefore I'm going to put it in that bin. All right, so often you get things like glittery cards, birthday cards and wrapping paper. People think they're paper and card, but actually they're plastic. Crisp packets, as I've said, fruit netting are all things that tend to cause confusion. So the policy report that we've put together is advocating for this clearer packaging and design. So making that material identification easier, but also making sure we're designing packaging for the infrastructure that we've got. So designing for recycling, which we shall see if that happens. So that's the main project bit. If anybody is interested in reading more, the QR code to the policy report is there, and also to our materials hierarchy. So this was produced by one of the material scientists, and it's basically a hierarchy where you can go in and you can put any packaging or polymer type, and it will tell you the most sustainable and economically viable end-of-life fate or reuse fate for that particular item. So it's been used quite a lot by waste management companies and by industry, but it's quite good to have a bit of a play around with as well, if you're interested in different sorts of packaging types. Just give you a chance to get that. I'm hoping it's working. I did test it the other day, but I'm always paranoid that these things are going to stop or someone's going to pull the plug at the university on the website. Okay, so where have we got with this? We've actually had a fair amount of success so far. So from a media sense, the findings have been picked up quite a bit. We were really lucky at the beginning of this year to end up in the Sunday Times magazine with quite a featured piece by Matt Rudd on recycling. I had the pleasure last year of being on the BBC, and I always get these things are always put to me as if they're going to be, oh, great opportunity, Helen, and it's always something then a bit daft. So it was a bit like a Blue Peter challenge. They had me in the centre of Stockport with a pasting table and different items that could be recycled, and members of the public had to come up and decide which bin they went into. So I spent all day doing that. So that was fun. And then I've also been in Best magazine, which my mum is quite over the moon about. She said, oh, Helen, you've made it now, you're in there. So I was like, oh, okay. But importantly, whilst we've had this media success, we've also had some policy traction too. So October last year, there was a new proposal put forward by the previous government of something called simpler recycling. So this is a proposal which was introduced to try and get some form of alignment across the UK in terms of recycling, so that you can recycle the same items wherever you go within the country. It's a common sense approach. We don't know whether the current new government is going to carry on with that. We're keeping our fingers crossed, but it very much aligns with the policy report and the things that we have put out there. So I'm just noticed the time, so I will whiz through these next slides a little bit quicker, but really just to look at how we can then extend some of this work. So for me, this is about moving beyond the current policies that we have in waste, and particularly those policies that are focused around behaviour change. So the work from the One Bin project has informed other things that we've been working on. As Alistair mentioned, I've done a very small project on fly tipping. I'm always a bit dubious about mentioning the fly tipping project because it's such a controversial issue, because bins are anyway, but fly tipping definitely is. But this is again about applying this approach to try and understand the reasons why fly tipping is occurring and then how we can tackle it. So rather than thinking, yes, you know, if we know fly tipping is wrong, people should stop doing it, well, what's actually causing them to be fly tipping? And I think it's important sort of to recognise as well how fly tipping is defined too. So, you know, if you have a big family and you've got more waste than you can put into your general waste bin, and you put a extra bin bag by the side of your bin, a lot of local authorities will class that as fly tipping, and you may get an enforcement notice, some may not. So again, it's just thinking about how do we define fly tipping, and also what's the nuance that we need to understand around why people fly tip. So from this, we know that fly tipping is more likely to occur in high density housing areas, so where it might not be clear whose bin is whose. Also where it's difficult for bin wagons to get around, so bins get missed, rubbish accumulates, and people find alternative ways of dealing with that waste, be that, you know, contaminating other bins or fly tipping. And then other factors such as lack of digital inclusion, language barriers, subletting may all also affect the extent to which that people can engage with different local authority guidance. So really, I think this work has led to us to broaden out how we think about waste policy, understanding the circumstances and context of what happens when people make those waste and disposal decisions, and sort of thinking about how we can make things easier for them to make the right decision. Because if we don't, we end up with these unintended consequences. So as I said before, that whole idea of the plastic bottles being recycled into clothing that then leads to this microplastic release into the ecosystems. We see unintended consequences of different policies as well. And what that can lead to is also unintended inequalities as well. So, as I've said, we've got people hiding stuff in other bins that then contaminates those bins, that then affects what happens when it goes to the municipal recycling facilities. We've got people wish cycling, so again, stuff ends up in the wrong bin. We've got people feeling that they've got to deconstruct items. And then another good example, I think, of unintended consequences, and it's one I wanted to sort of shoehorn in somewhere, it's a slightly different project. A colleague of mine is working with MasterCard to look at how we can recycle credit cards. So I had this conversation with him, and I sort of said, well, people cut up their credit cards, don't they? So how are you going to recycle them? So this is then fed into that project. This is something they had not thought of, okay? So again, technocentric solution, okay? What can we do about those technocentric solutions? We need to think about what people are actually doing with those things. So how people actually interact with things is really important for trying to design a circular economy. So we need design policies that take these activities, that take these practices into account, and that also make doing the right thing as easy as possible. But a little bit of a caveat, and I know I'm going over. Household circularity is not something new. So whilst we hear circular economy as this buzzword, actually lots of us engage in circularity in various ways every day. So circulating and sharing things have been a feature of functioning society for centuries. You might share things with your neighbours. That might be garden items. You might share things that you've grown in your garden. If you're going on holiday, you might go and share things, you know, the food that's going off. You might have a neighbour that will repair things for you. So we see all these acts of reciprocity and circularity in our research, and we saw it in the One Bin project, so that sharing of bin space being a good example, these neighbourhood WhatsApp groups. But often these activities which are already taking place are overlooked, and they're overlooked in policy as well. So again, there's this sort of narrative that's about households not caring, households wanting disposability, but actually it's another example of where circularity already occurs that we really could capitalise on. So final slide, I promise. How can we make a change? So I think we need to advocate for a better understanding of what people are doing with things. This is what this whole presentation has been about. Identifying these areas of opportunities for more sustainable endeavours, from the macro to the micro, and how we can weave that into policy. So if we think about the macro, it's about recognising how those social practices can have a huge impact on different technological developments for environmental sustainability challenges. So thinking about the credit card example, how someone cutting up their credit card means a whole recycling system needs to either adapt to that practice, change that practice so people stop cutting them up, or recycle them in a cut up state, which I think is where they've got to. You know, same with this packaging of cartons and crisp tubes. How can we make sure that that process is easier, okay? And that those designs are made for disposal. And then thinking about the micro, so recognising the on-the-ground localised circular activities which are already taking place. So those neighbourhood WhatsApp groups, the bin sharing. We might find probably now that a lot of the municipal recycling facilities have reuse shops. So as you go along and you've got stuff that you want to take to the tip to get rid of, you can actually leave functioning items there, and then they will be available for reuse by other, which has all sorts of equitable and sustainable advantages to doing something like that as well. There's a big rise in the repair movement in the UK. So there's now 140 repair cafes across the UK, and we've seen a big rise in the right to repair movement as well, so that you're now able to repair items which you couldn't before. So there was a big thing a few years ago about the iPhone screwdriver, which apparently you can now get hold of. We've seen people setting up libraries of things for the sharing of items that you don't use every day. So decorating tools, gardening implements, things that you might not necessarily need to own, but you might use, you know, a one-off. These are all activities that could be built upon to enable us to move away from that make, take, dispose focus. But obviously the hierarchy should always be to reduce first, reuse, repair, redistribute, and then recycle. So I sort of want to finish, and I've rushed through this last bit, I'm sorry about that. How can we best capitalise on these different community forms of circularity and embed those into policies for a more sustainable and equitable future? Thank you.